Hello, everyone, here on Zoom and indeed in the studio, and of course, everyone else online. Thank you for coming to, just going to spotlight my own video. There we go for everyone. Okay, thank you for coming to this November Talks lecture today with Daniel Barber, who we're really lucky to have, who's zooming in all the way, I think, from Germany. A little bit about November Talks and what they do. November Talks are supported by the Sto Foundation, and they've been supporting educational projects for students around the world for 15 years. And we're very lucky to have them supporting the series of November Talks for last year and indeed this year at the London School of Architecture. So about Daniel, Daniel Barber is Associate Professor and Chair of the PhD program in Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. His research and teaching narrate environmental histories of architecture and explore pathways into the post-hydrocarbon future. His most recent book is Modern Architecture and Climate, Designed Before Air Conditioning, and also following on A House in the Sun, Modern Architecture and Solar Energy in the Cold War. Daniel edits the Accumulation series on eFlux, the eFlux website, if you don't know it, architecture, and he is the co-founder of Current, Collective on Environment and Architectural History. He has had fellowships at Harvard and Princeton universities and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I also want to add a little bit, it's quite a long introduction for Daniel because he's so well learned. He's currently a senior fellow at the Kate Humberger Institute of Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at the University of Heidelberg, where he's working on two projects: Thermal Practice, which explores how architects and inhabitants co-create the thermal conditions of the built interior, and Architecture of the Aftermath, which is a take on the title of this lecture, which considers the role of architecture in mediating the climate crisis. Both these projects draw on a combination of theoretical, archival, and technological research methods as they seek to reconsider the history of architecture with energy and climate in the foreground. Anyway, enough of me. I'm going to hand over to Daniel Barber today. So thank you very much, Daniel.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I hope you can hear me all okay. I'm sure you'll let me know if otherwise. I'm just going to go ahead and do the screen share dance, and then we'll get things started. Okay. Oops, moved a little bit. Okay, let me know at any point if any of the slides slip around, but we should be good. Great, so thank you so much for that introduction. I really appreciate it, really appreciate the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here and participate in this lecture series at the London School of Architecture. I should say I've watched sort of from afar as this school has grown and really begun to model a really important and novel approach to design education. So especially excited to be speaking with you all tonight. Of course, we come together this evening at the end of yet another disappointing conference of the parties, COP26 just closing in Glasgow. A reminder that world leaders are maybe not to be relied on, right, to instigate the social transformations we need towards a different relationship to energy, climate, and ways of life in the 21st century. Pressure must continue to be applied through protest, resistance, and political agitation, of course, also through, there we go, also through professional and cultural reevaluations and transformation. Sorry, my slides are just a tiny bit off. I'm trying to fix that. There we go. Nitpicking here, there we go. It's up to us, that is to say, not as individual students to compensate for corporate behavior, but as collectives and professional bodies to aspire to different practices, standards, and obligations. Dare I suggest, as I will play out a small piece of this evening, that the role of architecture in the climate emergency is less in the capacity to produce and provide technological solutions. That's innovations, right, that can sort of get us out of this situation, and more, or at least very much so, in our cultural ambitions, our collective aspirations as designers, academics, engineers, planners, interior designers, and on, instigation to transform our collective aspirations and to imagine and build a different sort of future world. So my task, my sort of project tonight is in this sense twofold. First, to contribute to this cultural sort of regeneration, right? To provide indeed some historical narratives and conceptual frameworks that might help to cultivate this kind of shift that we're seeing in so many places in the field. I'll recount a history to this end. My sort of little piece of this here focused on the use of shading devices in Brazil. And then also as a sort of second task, and a bit more speculatively, as Jason mentioned, I'm currently on this fellowship and exploring ways of kind of understanding sort of not so much where we are, but kind of when we are in terms of the kind of epochal shifts that we're all facing and anticipating in the various life worlds that we inhabit. So my second task is to consider the urgency that we face, right? And to kind of suggest that in architecture, we, and by we, I mean sort of design professionals generally, right? That we collectively find ourselves past a point of no return. That is to say, in the aftermath of a localized professional collapse with global effects, a terminal moment that is an end of one way of living and a building towards the beginning of another. In other words, what I want to consider here today, the question of architecture's embeddedness in the climate emergency, and some historical background on the possibility of its transformation. I want to redraw some of the familiar contours of the history of modern architecture, and to present it, and I'll use this phrase a few times, right? To present it as a history of climatic adaptability, right? To sort of reframe buildings as devices for climatic change. For better or worse, as we'll see, but also as a medium through which our collective future can be imagined and built. An imagination that resists models such as this, images such as this, an imagination that can begin to forecast not only new norms and standards, but also new values and aspirations. So trying to begin, again, to sort of question the disciplinary and professional frameworks that lead to projects such as the one on the screen, I assume known to many of you, sort of super talls that are populating New York, although with less speed than heretofore. The investments in time, money, and labor that simply perpetuate the carbon problem, exacerbated with the spoils, the profits going only to a few. I'm not going to belabor this evening the platitudes of architecture's culpability, right? Everyone here knows, no doubt, that the built environment and the building industry emits between 40 to 60% of global carbon emissions. That the embodied carbon in buildings, the costs of maintenance, largely relative to climate control, as in the ducts here and the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning units they serve. That these stand as one of the seemingly insurmountable obstacles to the goals of carbon neutrality, right? How to live without these sort of HVAC systems powering our lives. It's not only our ways of designing, but the supply chains, industry standards, the entire sort of complex of what we could call building culture revolves to some extent still today around a template of glass, concrete, and steel. And of course, mechanical heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, a template that is as obviously unsustainable as it is deeply embedded in our practices and processes. And, and I know here I'm sort of in this kind of little set of platitudes, kind of preaching to the converted, right? I'm in the kind of culture of architectural discourse in London, very much in attending to some of these issues, some of these concerns, but nonetheless to kind of get us all on the same page. And the point, and here a sort of more quotidian example, right, of an HVAC system. This is the heater and chiller that feed in the basement classroom that I often teach in, right? So I'm often thinking of this space that sort of keeps us alive as we sit in the basement, right? The point again is that from an architectural perspective, we have already passed the event horizon of the climate emergency. Modes of practice from last century, or perhaps even last year, no longer pertain. We design, build, speculate, imagine, and teach in the aftermath, after oil, after carbon, after a discipline, a profession, and an industry rooted in growth and expansion that needs to change inexorably. We are focused now, we're almost, right, sort of shifting focus, and very much the kind of naming of this aftermath is an attempt to sort of encourage that shift, right? Shifting focus towards care, maintenance, retrofit, reuse, and the careful articulation of how we can live comfortably and collectively without fossil fuel. The end of one world and the beginning of another. Air conditioning, quoting here Peter Sloterdijk from about a decade ago, air conditioning in the literal sense will establish itself as the main space political theme of the coming era, end quote. Of our era, that is. Through the architectural mediation of the thermal interior, we have produced a future marked by a specter of unlivability, as we recognize how the thermal comfort generated inside by systems such as this one has degraded the prospects for life outside today and in the future. So tonight I'm going to kind of play out an alternative history of architecture, at least a case study as part of it, a case study that historicizes this thermal interior, sensitive to its prospects and pitfalls, a sort of archive for the architecture of the aftermath, case studies and conceptual frameworks that allow us to embrace, again, the kind of inevitability of climate changed architecture. My ambitions here are, in a word, disciplinary, right? Which is to say kind of absolute relative to our field. That is reframing, reimagining, reconsidering the contours of architecture, energy, and climate at the scale of the discipline. The problems are systemic and structural. Tonight, I'm simply prying open the box, right? Kind of looking into it. Of course, my own historical research is just one of many attempts to search in the present for the future of architecture's history, for a history attendant to that future. We are here indebted to Barnabas Calder's recent epic tome on architecture and energy, Jiatpi Chang's insightful analyses of the history of air conditioning in Singapore, Hannah LaRue's path-breaking work on asbestos and toxicity, Elisa Iturbey's project of overcoming carbon form deep in the heart of the autonomous tradition, and the speculative practices of colleagues such as Design Earth, Meme Studio, and others, all rescripting, and one could sort of go on and list many more, right? But all rescripting in different ways the past of architecture to open towards a different kind of future. Dare I suggest that those interested in this broader stream might keep their eyes on the Current Collective for Architecture and Environmental History, current-collective.org, an online platform I've been developing with Carson Chan and Bilal Al-Sayer. We'll be publishing our first dossier of articles, hopefully by year's end. And just again, a taste of this, right? I mean, there are many others, of course, these currents, if you will, many other emergent streams of architectural research intertwined inexorably with questions of spatial, racial, and social equity, an insistence that there is no decarbonization without decolonization and vice versa, a notion that will preoccupy aspects of the history I'm about to dive into. Okay, there we go. What is proper to every event, Isabel Stengers writes, is that it brings the future that will inherit from it into communication with the past narrated differently. Ending that quote. Just take a second to piece that together. I'll say it again in a moment. The stories that we tell create worlds. We sit today at the hinge, both the past and future clouded by a reliance on carbon, by a method of designing and building so deeply embedded in the contours of neoliberal financialization that it appears at times to be ornamentation, a cover story, a permission structure for the continuation of business as usual, of building as usual. Much as the accounting tricks of net zero relative to COP26 and the Washington Post's kind of amazing expose of the accounting, let's say, errors that have been occurring over the past decade in various carbon emission counts for a number of nations. Much as the accounting tricks of net zero have enabled rather than restricted emissions, so does the history of sustainable architecture appear to be, from our post-COP26 historical vantage point, an excuse to allow the building industry to continue to drive the carbon economy. So again, what is proper to every event is that it brings the future that will inherit from it into communication with a past narrated differently. One such event, the emergence of climate-focused architecture in the 1930s and 40s, is what I want to focus on for a bit this evening. An architecture engaged with and thinking about the way that a building relates to its immediate climatic surround. Again, just a case study, but one which challenges our patterns of disciplinary knowledge and focuses us collectively on rescripting our histories. In particular, to recognize that much of the excitement of the promise of modern architecture as a socio-technical project had to do with conceiving of the building as a device for climatic adaptability. So this past narrated differently, that I hope might serve as a sort of part of an inheritance, right, for a heretofore unexpected future. Yet, as we will see, this is less of a sort of technocultural triumph or some sort of architectural solutionism than it is a cautionary tale, a productive complication, I hope, of the threads of disciplinary knowledge that help us imagine and build the architecture of the aftermath. Okay, so we'll start our story in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro in the early 1940s, with this building, the Instituto de Seguros do Brasil, the Brazilian Reinsurance Agency, which I'll call, as it's known in Rio, the IRB. What better site, indeed, to reconsider the contours of architecture's relationship to a purportedly progressive modernity than a building constructed to manage risk, or really to meta-manage the risk of capital investments, right? Reinsuring insurers and corporations anxious to join in the industrialization, the modernization, the capitalization of the Brazilian territory. A saga that plays out in related ways across so-called developing economies, still of the so-called global South, an explicit means then of exporting a set of economic systems, a new set of social expectations through buildings. Modern architecture is a sort of interventionary mechanism here, expanding the scope and increasing the velocity of the flow of capital, expanding the territory of the global. The IRB was commissioned by the government of Getulio Vargas and designed and built in Rio in 1942 by the Roberto brothers, two of whom had studied under Lucio Costa. The building had an elaborate set of shading mechanisms. It was carefully designed for dynamic interaction with its climate. The different facades had different treatments according to their solar exposure. The north sun-facing facade, seen here on the left, had alternating banks of fixed shading louvers with two vertical circulation systems faced in glass brick. The south and east facade consisted largely of horizontal bands of carefully placed fenestration. We'll look at both of them in more detail. We can also glimpse here, just kind of zooming in to this still in construction nature of the surroundings, suggesting the importance of climate, right, as a sort of factor, an aspect of an architecture focused on economic development in this period. This building, again, a government-funded building to house reinsurance agents such as Lloyd's and Swiss Re, explicitly a means to encourage and facilitate development in the Brazilian hinterland. The northern facade, again, that we're seeing here, I'm going to zoom in on some other images. The northern facade consists of two layers. The first, as we can see in the section, was about 2/3 glazing, right? The kind of interior layer was about 2/3 glazing. The second exterior layer was of fixed louver panels hung at a slight distance. The second skin was prefabricated and attached on site in just 2 days. The reinforced concrete louvers were formed in a shallow S curve in plan, and we can see it's not quite an S, it's kind of more like a little speed bump. The shallow curve in plan. The outer face of the louver was a heat deflecting surface, as the diagram indicates, to block the penetrating rays of the summer sun, while the inner face was light reflecting, increasing the daylight transmitted to the interior. There was also a heat dispersion space, right, between the interior sort of glazed facade and then the louvers just past it. A heat dispersion space allowing for hot air to be ventilated above. And we see here on the far right, these other louver systems that allowed that air to be sort of drawn out right to the top, drawing the heat thereby away from the glazing. The interior wall, also evident in section, was divided between a thick storage block at the bottom, itself also heat deflecting, and then this series of operable windows. We can see the effects of this system in period photographs of the interior. Little direct solar penetration, but perhaps quite light. It's difficult to tell given the vicissitudes of film exposure. These daylit aspects were intensified by the use of open spaces, glass brick walls, and other transparent partitions, and the consigning of filing systems and other bulky elements to the periphery, right? So sort of open plan, right, that allowed the light to move quite freely. This was an early attempt using modern materials and techniques to align a building with its regional climate in order to control, to some extent, the thermal and lighting conditions of the interior. However much we may be able today to identify its numerous misapprehensions, it was the avant-garde of its moment, even more so than we might imagine. The historian and curator Barry Bergdahl, introducing the 2015 exhibition Latin America Under Construction at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, wrote that the emergence of a distinctly South American modernism involved in this period, right, around the period of World War II, involved projects and buildings that, and I'm quoting Bergdahl here, quote, are not the belated reflections of examples set in Europe, but previsions of a modernization to come, end quote. An event on the terms that we're negotiating here, offering both a different past and a different future, and a premise which, it is worth noting, and as Bergdahl himself notes, has been a part of Brazilian written histories for some decades, which is to say, histories of modern architecture written from Brazil often narrate them as having an important aspect of things starting in Brazil rather than being a site of reception. So it's to say again that Bergdahl helps us tease out something very important, right? Brazil was a site of emergence, of production, more than a site of reception of modern architectural ideas. The arrow of history moves not only back to customary practices of shading, screening, and others in order to go forward, but also from south to north, right? A complication of causes and effects that also places climate and the elaboration of design methods to manage the thermal interior at the center of familiar architectural narratives. Okay, so speaking of not familiar architectural narratives, at least familiar architects, we could, were we so inclined, draw this notion of the building as a device for climatic adaptability back to well-trodden territory and hope to see it anew. In the interwar period, Le Corbusier was preoccupied by climate control, by the building as a system of climatic mediation with wildly varying effects. This project in Barcelona was considered by Le Corbusier to be an experiment in the warmer Mediterranean climate, right? A relative south to his Parisian north. It was proposed as a resolution relative to the basic premise he explored in the innovations initially presented in the domino drawing, right? A sort of famous, of course, first year kind of moment, perhaps for many of us. Which is to say, once the domino drawing was imagined and the facade was sort of released to be filled with glass, it soon faced the problem of overheating. Indeed, early in his promotion of the so-called Pont de Verre in 1928, Le Corbusier already feared that the hour of, to quote him, the hour of doom was coming, end quote, right, for the all-glass wall. Once he realized it was not feasible outside of the very specific climate conditions of Northern Europe, and arguably not even there. This was resolved by the addition of brise soleil, as we're seeing on the right. Sun-breaking devices here in the project in Algiers to modulate solar radiation and keep the interior comfortable. Back to the Barcelona example, the banks of operable shading louvers on these compact townhouses, as this sectional drawing and a much later built model suggest, offer sort of a new sort of epical moment for the progressive claims of architectural modernity. One that was derived from experiments in Brazil and elsewhere by indicating graphically the different possible positions of these louvers. So I'm kind of obsessed, in fact, with this little bit right here, right, where Le Corbusier is using a simple graphic mechanism to show the different positions that these shading louvers can go through as the sun changes its path, or moves in its path over the day or over the seasons, and one can adjust the louvers accordingly. I won't belabor today how Bergdahl's inverted causal arrow south to north, right, might also help us to understand how in Le Corbusier's self-promotion of his use of the brise soleil, he was in fact communicating and popularizing the lessons he learned from his 1930 and 1936 trips to South America. I'll also ignore the fraught debate about his role in the best known of these mid-century buildings, the Ministry of Education and Health, though we'll look briefly at the building in a moment. Rather, following this gesture toward a broader narrative, I want to return to how shading devices helped to shepherd in Brazil and elsewhere, a new way of designing with attention to climate patterns as a sort of refinement of architectural forms of political and economic interventionism. Okay, so to return to our story. The details of the siting and facade treatment of the IRB was informed by a related effort towards increased scientific knowledge of the Brazilian territory, including its climate. The new National Institute of Technology, based in Sao Paulo, examined climate patterns to consider their effects on the population. Buildings were an essential medium, the means through which emergent knowledge in the natural sciences was seen to be applied to the population. intended to improve social well-being. And I'm just sort of clicking through some of these images, getting this research on the table as an indication more than relative to the precise details of their analyses, though those are also quite compelling, an indication of architects seeking geophysical knowledge, positioning themselves as amenable to collaboration. An emergence of collaborative practice, this emergence of collaborative practice was not unique to Brazil. Here, a version from the American Journal Architectural Record. Similar experiments were playing out at the Royal Institute of British Architects, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and perhaps with the most elaboration at the time at the University of Sydney, as Daniel Ryan has documented. Again, just some hints of how these experiments in Brazil resonated across and reflected discussions around the world, previsions, perhaps pre-mediations of a modernization to come. Here is another version of solar analysis reproduced by Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, opening towards a series of images resonant with what the media theorist Willem Flusser referred to as the technical image, a type of media that is infused both with new data and scientific approaches on the one hand, and that is also caught up in ideas and desires about how this knowledge influences the way we live. Here's a perfect example of this kind of technical image, right? The schematic bioclimatic index by Victor and Aladar Ogyay on the right, in which we see both a psychometric chart, which is to say a data-informed, relatively scientific drawing, and perhaps known to many of you here, and also this indication of desire, right? This sort of gendered notion of this gentleman relaxing in his Corbusian chaise, perhaps smoking a pipe, reading the newspaper, a businessman at home, imposed as a sort of universal experience of comfort and an aspirational model for climate management. But back again to Brazil and also to the IRB, where we have another useful early example of the technical image infused with both data and desire. We just looked at the north facade a moment ago. Here's an image of the south and east with a diagram drawn by Milton Huberto to explain their thinking. We can see in the photo on the left the general approach, alternating bands of glazing and concrete, as Milton writes, describing this series of drawings on the right. The exterior walls, he writes, could have been all glass, and I'm quoting, very modern, of course. Those were his words, right? But due to sun and much light in Rio, and thanks to, quote, scientific computing done with data, some of the engineers that he collaborated with that we just saw, the science basically said it should be this sort of centered rectangular window, right? I mean, kind of center top rectangular window. However, architecture culture suggests otherwise. As Roberto concludes, everybody knows since Louis Sullivan that a horizontal window is preferred. The results, he finishes, come take a look. Now, this artifact is on a continuum with some of the drawings I just clicked through above. It's less an analytic image aiming to determine the ideal design according to climatic parameters. In this case, more sort of post hoc justification intended for the client, for publication, for public relations, right? This drawing was in Brazilian, North American, European journals, Australian journals around the world. So it helps to clarify, I think, that climate data was being brought into design method on architectural terms, right? As an intervention in form, as an aspect of discourse, as part of an emergent architectural culture, allowing us to begin to consider how climate knowledge was changing that culture over the 20th century. Here again, the relative impact of this approach on the interior, aided by some internal shades. A few essential points, I hope, are starting to become clear. First of all, the importance of Brazil and other so-called peripheries, so with scare quotes here in case you're not looking, right? In tracing the significance of climate design methods. So the importance of these, centering these peripheries in order to understand the history of architecture and climate. Placing these so the importance of these so-called peripheries, the importance of media, right? Images made both by engineers and by architects, as novel forms of communication, as technical images of both data and desire. And I've also started to suggest, and we'll focus on in a moment, the relevance of the specific geopolitical context from which these experiments emerged, and understanding both their discursive and material impact. But first, just to give some sense of this broader emergence that I'm sort of implicitly referring to, right? To start to build up the database, if you will, the many different ways that facade treatment sought to alter the experience of the interior, aimed, that is, to place the thermal interior on a different relationship with the regional climate. One thing that some of you may notice in reference back to Le Corbusier's Barcelona project is that the shading devices at the IRB that we've just discussed at length were fixed rather than dynamic, right? The same firm built this speculative office building, again intended for occupation by insurance agencies, seguradoras, in downtown Rio in 1949. It's an important piece of evidence, one of my favorite of their buildings. We can see the differently treated facades, and in fact, a number of different systems for adjustment, right? I mean, so here's one facade and here's the more articulate, more carefully shaded one. And we see this different set of louvers, this kind of handle here that allows you to move these louvers in horizontal and vertical and diagonal means. We also see, of course, the kind of extended shaded eave on top, and then these kind of slats, right, that are covering the bottom half that can also be adjusted and moved in different ways. Another example, Paulo Ribero's speculative office building in Salvador da Bahia, further north in Brazil, had two layers of wooden slatted screens, a movable horizontal version in the interior layer, and then a fixed vertical screen on the exterior, right? So one could sort of crosshatch them to produce the most shade. Back in Rio, a large speculative office block, again by the Robertos, relied on this straightforward light metal shading system, one in fact much like the one that we just saw, though here more or less standing on its own, aside from these also horizontal system, easily manipulable. And again, we can note the importance of this image on the right, also published in journals around the world, in its claims on the progressive premise of their practice. The architects thoughtfully engaged with the climatic adaptability embedded in their design. Another Roberto project, a relatively small residential building on the then in development Copacabana Beach, right? I mean, if anybody's been to the south end of Copacabana, it's now sort of covered with hotels and apartment towers that make this building look super tiny, but it was one of the larger ones in the period, in the mid-40s. Also helps to clarify an essential point, right? And we see it especially in this section, the way in which they're sort of providing a script through again, this piece of media, right? This technical image that's trying to both describe how the building operates and sort of cultivate a sort of desire for this type of interaction. We can see a kind of dance that's being choreographed here. Maybe you open the bottom sash in the morning to let some fresh air in, right? You're protected from the sun at noon. Depending on the season, you might want to lift the screen to allow some evening sun in while you're sitting in this kind of little interior garden and enjoying your caipirinha, for example, not to paint. I mean, in fact, most of this choreography was probably done by the domestic help rather than by the inhabitants themselves. And there's issues of class that pervade this discussion that I'd be happy to return to. But compelled by, right, this kind of scripted interaction and these kind of forms of habitual involvement that this section implies. If HVAC aims to normalize the thermal interior almost without the inhabitant noticing, right, aside from setting the dial, this facade, let's call it a prevision of things to come, imagines daily life as a sort of collaboration between the sun, the building, and the inhabitant. It suggests that we, people who inhabit spaces, our patterns and desires, need to change along with the built environment that we inhabit, a point that I'll return to. In other words, an architecture of climatic adaptability implicates the daily habits and practices of individuals and collectives, thereby refining, perhaps, our sense of the relationship of architecture to the prospects of socio-environmental change. There are many other possible examples with either fixed or dynamic shades in Brazil and elsewhere, built and unbuilt. Some of these, as I'm showing, as you see in the slide, are collected from the Olgiai's book, Solar Control and Shading Devices of 1957. Not all of them. These suggest a sort of interdisciplinary effort of architects, engineers, and meteorologists in a context both geopolitical and geophysical that achieved in this period before HVAC was widespread, achieved the globalization of the international style, which is to say that modernism spread first through shading mechanisms, for better or worse, right? We'll get to that in a moment. Each building not only brings with it its own set of design drivers, it also provides evidence of different aspects of climate knowledge, and again, different socio-political contexts. Sorry, I'm supposed to be on this side when I say socio-political context. This unbuilt building for the Bahrain Petroleum Company that was part of a series of expos, a kind of series of images of shaded buildings in architectural record in 1952. Okay, another piece of evidence, a better known building that allows me to clarify some of the ambiguities in these efforts that I'm describing and start to kind of walk towards a conclusion. Likely the most famous example of Brazilian shaded modernism is the Ministry of Education and Health. I assume known to many of you here, a building designed by Lucio Costa with the young Oscar Niemeyer and a team of architects and engineers. The sun-exposed facade contains an egg crate system, each module filled with a bank of 3 or 4 adjustable louvers. We can see in this slide the louver adjustment system on the left. It was broken when I visited about 6 years ago, but it's since been updated, repaired. And then on the bottom left here, Costa's well-known technical image, right? A sort of diagram of the relationship of that louver system with its 3 different settings to the daily path of the sun. And you can see this little dot here. I hope you can see where my cursor is, which is to say, sometimes you have to turn the light on, right? But the rest of the time, you can basically leave it off. The facade treatment of the ministry building was not only about shading per se, about the direct daylighting and thermal effects on the interior, but also about the presentation of modernity, as Milton Roberto sketched it out relative to the IRB. Come and take a look. A government building that sought to demonstrate on the facade for all to see the seemingly progressive economic and social principles, the care for the population of then President Getulio Vargas's so-called Estado Novo. It was, in other words, both symbolic and material. We can recall the insurance buildings and speculative office buildings just reviewed as designs that saw in the, we can recast those buildings as designs that saw in the climate dynamism of the facade an opportunity to intensify flows of capital. Quite explicitly, again, mechanisms of insurance and reinsurance, spaces for agents of global commerce, an interior space conditioned relatively by non-mechanical means as a broader intensification and exploitation of resources and labor in Brazil, right? So a kind of entry point architecturally to sort of bring different forces, different economic forces into the country at the behest of the government, right? At the behest of Vargas's regime. At the ministry building, the facade aimed to reflect a form of benevolent governance. It was to be read as modern, despite the consolidation of power going on inside. In this important sense, it is a mask, right? A facade in the sense of a deception, or at least a partial one, aiming to parade an enlightened approach about care for the population, about education and health, for a political regime that was increasingly centralized and authoritarian. As Vargas articulated, a form of governmentality focused on conceptualizing citizens as a population to be optimized, right? Forms of labor, economic activity, insurance, and growth framed this approach, alongside techniques, media, and processing systems through which educational, health, and climate data could be put to work towards specific repressive ends. A slight twist, perhaps, to what might have been this evening, a narrative of a technical fix of architecture as the solution to a regionally considered, historically bounded set of geophysical complications. If only that were the case. Rather, we see in climatic modernism and its legacy quite clearly that the shaded facade was deployed in attempts to normalize the thermal interior, however inadequately on today's terms, according to a universal physiological norm, a comfort zone, right? Recall the man smoking the pipe on the chaise, a comfort zone that is just as often a feint, a deception, a claim to sensitive modernity, that was in fact a facade for government intervention, for the internal or endocolonization of Brazil, its people, and its hinterland, for consolidating power among the elite. An avant-garde, perhaps, as much for innovations in design culture as for a sort of advanced outpost of the forces of capital, of the broader historical transformation from direct colonial rule to methods of resource and labor extraction piloted by corporations. Here, for example, to kind of spread our story out a bit, the headquarters for British Petroleum, with banks of movable vertical louvers designed by Max Fry and Jane Drew with Drake and Lasden, the shading system seemingly required to provide a space in the tropics for occupation by British and European corporate agents. That was a Freudian slip there, right? In a region replete with oil, but not the infrastructure that could provide adequate energy yet for cooling by mechanical means, right? So the shading system here was kind of needed in order to make this building functional for Northern and Western agents in a tropical zone so that they could sort of coordinate the extraction of oil from the Niger Delta in a fashion that, as many of you know, has been sort of incredibly catastrophic for that Delta and the people that live in it. BP House opened in Lagos, Nigeria on October 1, 1960, the exact day of Nigeria's independence from British rule, a too easy indication of the sort of handoff from direct forms of colonial occupation to a globalized corporate interventionism that characterizes, again, far too many post-colonial histories across the global South. The building as energetic object takes on an additional dimension, not only managing in the disposition of its facade system the flows of capital, but quite literally serving as a node to connect that capital to the oil reserves and the hinterland, the energy-saving facade, facilitating administrative practices of resource extraction, labor exploitation, and in this case, the explicit corporate violence as BP, Shell, and others profited from the decimation of the Niger Delta. Also resonant, and this is actually a sort of glimpse of the next stage of research, once kind of I can travel again freely, as I'm sure we're all looking forward to. This set of, so also resonant across this set of resource, population, ecosystem, and political corruption dynamics is the Petrobras Building, designed by Roberto Gandolfi and built in 1972, as Brazil began to exploit the oil reserves on the Campos Shelf in the midst of a later oppressive dictatorial regime. If you know anything about the recent history of Brazil, you know that it has been very much about what was going on inside this building, right? Petrobras as sort of what was being hidden by this facade, the tales of corruption and conspiracy theories surrounding Petrobras and the profits allowed through its oil extraction and profit and extreme profits relative to the economic stability of the country. The tales of corruption and conspiracy theories, the narratives and effects of which are a bit too complex to recount today. But speaking of conspiracy theories and their relative truth value and impact on geopolitical dynamics, we can also look to the facades and interior disposition of a number of US embassy building projects in the Middle East and Africa in particular, that deployed shading systems intended to both reflect the patterns and habits of the cultures in which they were built, right? A sort of friendly facade, mitigating, at least in part, the extremes of the climate effects on the interior, and also hiding in ways that are in fact well documented, clandestine political machinations going on inside. Which is to say that the sort of embassy building boom of the 1950s, which also deployed a number of complex and often quite compelling shading mechanisms, was also the embassy building boom that was the expansion of the Central Intelligence Agency, right? The kind of emergence of the clandestine forces of war by other means that have determined the livelihood of many individuals and societies in those regions. So my framework here of a history of architecture as a device for climatic adaptability is also, it turns out, a framework for understanding climatic design as a method of neo and endo-colonial interventionism, the deployment of an assembly of materials and technologies that facilitated the relative comfort of Western and Northern agents entering into contested spaces, as the arts of colonial governance transformed into the corporate expansions of nascent neoliberalism. The building as a system of energetic intensification, of capital's elaboration, even when sheathed in a delicate dynamic shading system. Okay, so a few conclusions, and hopefully as a sort of means to open up to some discussions and questions from the audience. To shift the discussion again a bit, or sort of shift back, right? Return briefly to the comment from Bergdahl, his suggestion that Brazilian experiments, again, were not reflection of European models, but rather previsions of a modernization to come. We have seen this to be true in a few ways: in the dissemination of climate design strategies around the world, in the complications of architecture and neo-colonial corporate extractivism, in the proliferation of images and the elaboration of specific techniques. But the modernization that came following these previsions, as we know too well, was not that of design climatic dynamism. Across the 1980s and 90s, many of the buildings in Rio that we've been looking at had their shading devices removed, replaced with carbon costly in-window air conditioning units, right? This could be perhaps one possible candidate for the kind of moment of the shift to the aftermath, right? This kind of re-elaboration of the facade on starkly different terms. So we conclude a bit obliquely with the question of comfort or discomfort, and with a reflection on the thermal practices we both induce and produce. Comfort, as the architecture critic Tomás Maldonado wrote in 1987, around the same time that the shading devices in Rio and here in Lagos were being dismantled, replaced by in-window chiller units. Comfort, Maldonado writes, is a modern idea, and one shot through with the inequities of capitalist forms of developments. As Maldonado explains, quote, before the Industrial Revolution, the expectation of comfort was the privilege of the few, but the progressive diffusion of comfort to the masses was not accidental. There is no doubt that it has played, he concludes, a fundamental role in the task of controlling the social fabric of the nascent capitalist society, end quote. A bit heavy-handed, maybe relative to our familiar language today, but Richard Neutra reflected a similar disposition a bit earlier in his Architecture of Social Concern of 1947, and I quote again, there has, of course, always been comfort in the world, reckless comfort, we could say, comfort based on someone else's continuous labors, end quote. In this context, considering the role for architecture in the aftermath, after fossil fuels, an architecture that mitigates reckless comfort, draws on a history of which I have been describing one small part, an archive of technocultural proposals that perhaps begins to rehabilitate the dynamic facade and the kinds of interactions it elicits. The relative capacity of a building, its facade, to modulate the experience of the interior is also a space to trace the emergence, the imposition alongside these flows of capital, to map and produce a certain kind of normative interior, the space for a specific kind of life. Building provides comfort in this important sense. As designed objects, buildings are frameworks for increasing life potential. They have also been conduits for the processing of fossil fuels. Mechanically conditioned buildings essentially serve as inducement to draw fuel from the ground as they transform energy into emissions. All the debates and polemic sense of modernism and postmodernism, positions on parametricism and object ontologies, all of these are supported by the phantom presence of fossil-fueled air conditioning. As the anthropologist Dipesh Chakrabarty put in his well-known 2009 essay called The Climate of History, and I quote, the mansion of modern freedom rests on a foundation of fossil fuels, end quote. He wasn't referring directly to the history of modern architecture, but he certainly could have been. The facades I've been interested in are not approaching the normative universalism of air conditioning, which is to say, no matter how easily manipulated, one would not feel as comfortable within this space as happened later when a chiller, when a window unit was placed instead. Choreographing this relationship using the facade and its various components, its filters and screens, its openings and closings is a sort of script, seasonally adjusted, no doubt, a script that organizes a relationship between bodies and climates, between inside and outside. In this fashion, Brazilian buildings previewed a modernization to come, for better or worse. We can perhaps see in this past a vision of the future, right? Of architecture from the past that is also an architecture in the aftermath, that erodes dependence on carbon while maintaining a relationship while maintaining an emphasis on health and relative comfort, adaptive comfort in the sense of adjusting our own aspirations, right? Adapting our expectations of life inside to accord better with the prospects for a new kind of planetary future. Okay. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Daniel. Do you want to maybe stop sharing your screen? Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah,
I've said to people online, if they want to put questions into the chat, they can. I can read them out. However, I do have many, which I'm afraid I'll bore you with. First of all, thank you very much for that really fascinating introduction, or at least that alternative history into towards our quest for comfort. I'm kind of interested in the sense that, first of all, I want to know, how are the buildings that you presented, how are they received in the Western press? I know you kind of alluded to the fact that they're published in the Architecture Record, but how are they received by kind of the architecture kind of intelligentsia of the time? And kind of what was the immediate and indeed long-term response to those?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, there was a moment, I mean, there's a couple of threads of this here. I mean, on the one hand, important to recall that, relatively speaking, Brazil was insulated from World War II. Let's just kind of put it simply like that. It's significantly more complicated. But in that sense, there was a certain amount of building activity in South America in general, and Brazil in particular, in a period that was, less activity in Europe and the US. It was 1942, however, when Museum of Modern Art opened, an exhibition called Brazil Builds, that was a sort of long history of Brazilian architecture. And I defer you as well to my friend and colleague, Patricio Del Real, who's written about sort of Brazil and MoMA and Brazil's reception in the West a bit more directly. But even, so there was that exhibition, there were issues, there was a huge issue of Architecture d'Aujourd'hui, I think it was 1950, that was with a preface by Siegfried Gideon. There was a book written by Henrique Middelin, a Brazilian historian writing in English, to kind of present Brazil's side of its own architectural history, also with a foreword by Gideon, right? And all of this, I mean, I would say, without kind of laying it out scientifically, all of the major global journals at the time, had an issue on Brazil, had a focus on Brazil, had a sort of interest in what was going on in Brazil, and that that started out relative to kind of how was modernism playing out according to the specifics of the let's say geopolitical and technological and social forces in Brazil, and kind of slowly transformed into kind of interest in what was referred to as the kind of sensual modernism of Oscar Niemeyer, the kind of use of curves rather than straight lines, the complications of shading and glass that that we've seen in many other elements. One piece that I skipped over because I was running a little too long. There's a really interesting analysis by a management theorist named Mauro Guillen, who's not an architectural historian or just sort of interested in the field, who was interested to understand why does everybody know Le Corbusier and kind of not everybody else, right? I mean, why does the kind of general public have such a limited understanding of the leaders of modern architecture? And he did this in the context of an article on management theory, right? His co-writer did the same thing with ancient philosophy, like why do we talk about Socrates and not all the others, right? And they developed a theory they called the mutual halo effect, which is basically, in some ways, quite straightforward. Le Corbusier was at the center of networks, right? And so those networks were able to, everything went through him, right? But of interest, the point that I'm trying to make here, and I could jump back to a slide if we want to, I have an image of this, but of interest is that the second person on this this management theorist's list, right after Le Corbusier, is the most kind of connected architect of the time, was Gregory Vartropchick. That name might not mean much to you. It doesn't sound Brazilian, but in fact, he was a Ukrainian and Italian Brazilian immigrant who was quite prominent in the Sao Paulo modern circles. So it's just simply to say that Brazil was really at the heart of it in the 40s and 50s, and even to some extent the 30s and into the 60s as a space for experimentation, and was quite well received by many different figures, many different writers and many different journals in the West. I know I've already answered the question like 4 times, but one last piece is that Stamo Papadaki, a Greek emigre Brazilian architect, later went to New York, and he would write about Korb, he would write about Niemeyer, and he would be the managing editor for Progressive Architecture, one of the main journals in the US, with strong connections to Brazil. So there was a lot of kind of circumstantial means, but also substantive means by which Brazil had pretty good play, let's say, in the global discourse.
Yeah, thank you for that very detailed answer.
Yeah, sorry.
I was also kind of interested in terms of kind of how architects were practicing at that time, and indeed their research into where they were designing. Many were kind of practicing in the Middle East, where kind of the West was colonizing. I was wondering kind of what comparisons, or like what they were potentially even aware of architects such as the likes of Hassan Fathy in Egypt, and who Hassan Fathy is defined as being a modernist, but really it was I don't really like to use the word vernacular, but it was a vernacular type of architecture that strive to achieve thermal comfort through different means, through different material means. Were they aware of that? What was that even present in their research, and how comes their architecture wasn't responding to that?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any direct reference. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the old guys in particular. I mean, there's a kind of second chapter to the story and second half to the book, insofar as I've kind of summarized some of the issues of the first half, through which Victor and Alvaro Ogiai, the kind of design methodologists that we saw a few times in these slides, came to sort of formalize a lot of these practices and a lot of these histories, albeit in a kind of not explicitly historical fashion. Publishing books, developing curricula, getting grants. I mean, really kind of encouraging, attempting to really encourage a sort of mode of operation in the field that was attentive to climate dynamics. I think the really compelling bit about Fathy, and again, not being super clear if there were direct engagements, but what he helps us to see, and what the old guys in somewhat more subtle ways help us to see, is the extent to which part of the sort of project of modernism, right? I mean, one of its intents, one of its purposes speaking within architecture, one of its projects was to delegitimate, so-called pre-modern or vernacular or traditional, I like to use the term customary, right? I mean, was to delegitimate customary practices, right? Was to say, we're going to make a mark and all of that is no longer of value, and we will now move in a seemingly a claim to being moving in a kind of forward direction rather than backwards, et cetera, right? I think one of the things that Fathy does in very interesting ways is complicate that sort of temporal arrow, right? And say, in fact, these customary practices are in fact quite relevant, quite useful, can be quite helpful in specific situations. We could look in different ways at Van Eyck's interest in the Dogon, although that gets kind of complicated and somewhat colonial in its own right. But it's simply to say that most of these strategies that I was just kind of talking us through, shading systems broadly considered, were quite literally modernizations, right? Reconfigurations of customary practices with a different set of materials and sort of prospects. So while Fathy was a bit more explicit relative to materials and forms, we could say that the Ogiais and some of these other players that were operating in this context were more explicit on terms of a certain type of kind of technical prowess, right? A kind of certain type of technical affiliation, affinity that related to these histories of, again, customary practices, although only rarely referring directly to them. And when they did, of course, it was very romantic, right? It was, I mean, the Ogiais open their book with a kind of story of a visit to Mesa Verde in the American Southwest, built into the cliffs with overhangs protecting from the hot summer sun, et cetera. This kind of notion of a kind of natural way of life, I'm putting this in quotes, right? That they didn't quite call primitive, but many others in this discourse did. A sort of notion that there was some kind of way of being that in which we lived in harmony with the world that had been sort of transformed or disfigured, right? Which I think is more a sort of story they're telling themselves than anything else, but allows them to draw out then these kind of these technological figures technological strategies out of that field of operation.
Mm. And it's interesting to see kind of the environmental studies they were doing towards those buildings. Is there kind of any? We're also really curious to see the energy data compared to then and compared to now.
Yeah.
That,
I mean, something I'm actually have a grant out for right now is basically to hire a postdoc, because it's not stuff I know very well, and get the sensors and modeling systems in place to try to through contemporary monitoring understand the thermal performance of these buildings, both historically and in the present. And actually, Ian Jackson at Liverpool has done a bit of this on some slightly later African buildings in North Africa and West Africa, many of which have been reclad or kind of reconfigured in various ways. And he's been trying to understand, was the purpose behind that reconfiguration thermal or sort of more, in terms of the urban facade, in terms of its kind of representational condition. I mean, we could expand that story out too. I mean, I've done some work in this regard on the Bauhaus in Dessau. I mean, a building that, we don't even need a slide. I mean, I'm sure it's familiar to all of you here. Another early curtain wall building, in effect, with incredibly thin windows. I mean, if you've been there, they're wafer thin, this glass panels. It's a thermal nightmare, right? I mean, a beautiful building. I'm not trying to say anything bad about it, except that it doesn't perform well as a kind of system of carbon management. And I've studied and recounted the kind of history. I mean, the heating system at the Bauhaus was rebuilt 12 times in the past 100 years, which isn't really that many relative to other buildings of that age, but nonetheless, it's been a project, right, to keep that building sort of thermally habitable. So I think there's a broader set of questions, right, around how we understand once we reimagine the history of modern architecture according to its thermal interior elements, right? How does that change some of our narratives? How does that shift some of these stories? And it's not to say, good people become bad people. I mean, it's not about kind of these individuals, but rather understanding what they were working with, right? I mean, we could tell the story as well of the Seagram's Tower. Another colleague, Kiel Mo, has this amazing book called Unless. It's this sort of, embodied energy and network analysis of the building materials and construction systems that went into building the Seagram's Tower. With some really amazing stories, but it's again one of the worst. It is the worst performing skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, right? I mean, there was an analysis of building performance, and I think it was 2009, where buildings were rated on a 0 to 100, and the Seagrams came in at a 3, right? I mean, like almost a 0, and about 50 points worse than its closest competitor, which was the Lever House, right? Which was another modern icon. But it's not to say that Mies was bad or stupid or doing something wrong, but rather to understand that the forces that surrounded him, right? In the mid 50s, as that building was being imagined and going up, using as much energy as possible was a good thing, right? That was about the American century. That was about economic expansion. That was about sort of flows of energy and oil and capital and keeping economies flowing, right, and moving. And it's still the case today. I mean, it's, we still talk about the health of the economy, at least in the US context, relative to in terms of housing starts, right? I mean, how much building is going on is an indication how much energy is being used in that sense, right? I mean, these are not solar houses that are being built. So I think there's, it's not precisely to the question of how well they performed. I think there's a lot of questions about that. They certainly didn't perform to current ASHRAE standards, right? And that's why it was so easy to stick in these air conditioners. But at the same time, I think that we want to sort of question, what we value in that type of performance, what sort of behaviors and practices we might use, shift and reimagine for our own forms of inhabitation, what sort of performance how we can perform such that a building can perform differently and ideally with a bit less carbon, right?
I think the history that you presented reflects a pursuit of comfort as very much a technological pursuit, whereas if one was to adopt, say, I've 2 years ago, it's still fresh in my mind, is the Oslo Triennale of the architecture of degrowth, which kind of posited as well. reframing of technology as material technology, in which case, instead of a dynamic facade, have a material such as, I don't know, the mud brick or a different form of brick which can respond thermally and regulate temperature better.
Right.
And I think from my perspective, it's interesting to see the difference between those two pursuits, and which is why, again, like a bit like Anupama Kundu is lecturing later on in this series, and she has some approaches which are embodied in a lot of her architecture, which embody that approach. And indeed, that's why I also reference Hassan Fathy, because similar to that. So I'm not really asking a question there. I'm just making one of those boring nuanced comments, which is more apparently a question.
I think it's very much to the point. And again, I've I'm careful. I mean, certainly what I'm doing is just sort of one piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, I'm just teasing out this specific story, and all by all means necessary, right? Is sort of how we need to be approaching this situation. And I was actually happy to have the chance to write something for that Oslo Triennale. I mean, it was a few years ago now, but material. I mean, thermal materials. There's numerous engineers, technologists, kind of architecture technologists, if you will, working on different ways of engaging with some of these customary practices, or working with different forms of dead sea salts are very thermally active, right? And some analyses of buildings in Palestine and Israel has made it clear that there's a kind of capacity for bricks that were made from these types of salts. And of course, as you go back, then you find that there's been experiments in these sort of phase change materials, right, from the 20s and 30s, and a bit more elaborately in the architectural context in the 40s. So part of what I try to keep us focused on, let me put it this way. I think the architectural history courses or books or library, right, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, not only will maybe Fathy have more of a presence, or some of these other questions of materials, thermal materials, but just the complexity and proliferation of environmental histories of architecture that help us understand the variety of these traditions, technological, cultural, social. I mean, Fathy's project was very much a project about social well-being. Yeah, right? It was as much about sort of community cohesion and public health and so on, as it was about any type of building form or even climatic performance. Not that those two need to be disaggregated, but disambiguated. But it's to say that I think that the kind of library of architectural history in the coming decades will display all of these different individuals and schools and ideas, and the ways in which they interacted with each other, perhaps, or with other communities. And again, these kind of techniques and technologies that played out. I mean, I have a PhD student who's in effect writing a kind of history of a history of the passive house, not the passive house movement as it was kind of consolidated in Germany in the early 80s, but the super insulated projects that were being built in Northern Europe, in the United States, and for kind of explorations of parts further north. The use of super insulation as a means to kind of almost make solar energy obsolete, right? I mean, so well insulated that a tiny bit of sun would kind of heat the place for adequately, right? So there's all sorts of kind of histories and stories and discussions that I think are beginning to be played out, and that will have more exposure as time goes on, such that architecture will look very different, right? And the kind of traditions of the 20th century, the kind of stories we know, the maybe the canon, if we want to call it that, or the kind of survey knowledge that we all may have gotten in different ways through courses or through books, it's just one thread amongst many. And frankly, in this moment, part of what I'm hoping we can begin to realize is that it's, I don't know, maybe not the most important thread, right? I mean, to look at the kind of modern masters and their legacies, it's maybe less interesting than to understand some of these experimental practices going on around the world that we're struggling with some of these issues that we're struggling with again today, right? That we've kind of begun facing again in different ways.
Well, indeed, like any pursuit of technology or the kind of a dynamic facade that is respondent to a regional climate requires maintenance, and there's a carbon cost within that, etc. I mean, I look at Jean Nouvel's building in Paris, the World Arab Institute, which has arguably failed rather emphatically. Anyway, I want to get to a question which has been put through by a student at the LSA, by Will, and Will asks, I'm interested in your position as an architectural historian in the way that it frames the discussion around climatic architecture and the way it relates to the symbolic capital of these, quote, flagship buildings. I suppose that the large majority of the buildings used by the Petrobras to extract oil in Brazil are unknown, or at least architectural blind spots, as there are no nice monographs of refineries and workers' housing, and whether or not there is an interesting interplay between the buildings for the white-collar worker and the blue-collar worker. And that's a question, and he goes on to ask, how do we reevaluate these hidden architectural projects?
Yeah, that's a
thank you.
Sorry, is that good? Yeah, no, that's a great question, and in the work that I've done, I have a kind of separate, the British Petroleum House building, an article actually that just came out like 2 days ago, in a volume on sort of rethinking global modernism. And one of the things that I compare it to, and this is just a piece of what you're getting at, is what I kind of wonder is, why, as the questioner is suggesting, we know the architects of this building, it has this kind of pedigree to it, right? We have a kind of sense of its relationship to the history of modern architecture, even though it's not very well published. I mean, again, Ian Jackson has published on it, a few others, but it's even in books and discussions of Fry and Drew, it's kind of an outlier. But there was another building that, so Shell and BP actually sort of worked together. In effect, Shell sort of took over BP in the Niger Delta as a relative to a corporate agreement, and they had an office building at Port Harcourt, which is kind of southeast of Lagos. This incredible, I mean, I don't want to have to search through my files to find it right now, unfortunately, but it's an incredible sort of, almost kind of prison-looking office building, this large bar building with these intersecting elements, and indicating again not only the sort of difference in treatment and the kind of functionality of those sorts of industrial buildings relative to the kind of facade being presented at the urban core, but also just the intensity of those efforts, right? And when we go not only to those kind of office buildings, but to the refineries, to the pipelines, right, to the port infrastructures, the kind of built weight of the petroleum industry around the world, in some ways also intersecting. I mean, another scholar that's been working on related issues, Carola Hine at KU Delft, who's got an ongoing project on what she calls Petroleum Scapes. It's quite literally kind of understanding how oil transformed the landscape, right? And so is attentive to, I mean, is it a different scale? It's not quite at the building scale, but certainly is attentive to those sort of, let's say, seemingly unpedigreed buildings, right, if you will. I mean, I'm using that term, I guess, in quotes or somewhat ironically, but I think, and then there's other sorts of funny things. I mean, there's Philip Johnson's nuclear power plant in Israel, right? I mean, there's other kind of let's say icons, or what did he call them, flagship buildings, right? That help, but that give us access narratively, historiographically, right, to these kind of questions of what was the role of energy in helping us in thinking through the production of a certain type of building at a given moment. How can a kind of, let's say, a survey or a sort of analysis of corporate headquarters for oil companies, right, be maybe a kind of first pass, or a kind of accessible means to begin to get an understanding of how that corporate economy emerged and developed, and then perhaps lead to some of the refineries and port complexes. And of course, one could go the other way as well, but I think it's a really important set of questions. And I think that, one of the things that is also suggested in the question, how the dynamic, I mean, what's going on in Petrobras is the coordination of not only buildings and materials and systems, but has suggested a sort of a huge labor force, right? And to think about how, to think about the built environment of that labor force and how it resonates across, different collectives, different communities, different lifestyles. And in the context of, I mean, I know the story in Brazil a bit better than some of the other stories that one could recount, but these oil rushes, if you will, or these kind of energy. There were a couple of moments in the 30s, in the early 50s, and then the kind of mid to late 70s, oil discoveries, or sorry, I should say resource discoveries, including natural gas in Brazil, that led to rushes, right? People moving from all over the country to come to those spaces. That gets complicated by Petrobras because in the most recent saga, because a lot of that oil wealth is being developed in a deep sea dwelling in far offshore platforms, right? And so Timothy Mitchell's book, Carbon Democracy, proposes among many other things that one of the reasons that that we don't see a lot of labor unrest relative to the oil industry, as distinct from coal mining and coal strikes and et cetera, is that sort of remote aspect of the labor, right? Is the sort of, that these derricks or these oil rigs, are thousands of miles offshore in very dangerous conditions, and one is kind of dependent upon the corporation for their livelihood in quite a different way. And I can't recommend that anybody watch the film Deepwater Horizon because it's pretty atrocious, but it gives the idea of what's going on. I mean, you're really dependent on the system to kind of keep you afloat, quite literally, right? So a very different set of labor dynamics that I think is worthy of an architectural set of an architectural study. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. I want to pass the microphone over to Peter Buchanan, who's reader in architecture and urbanism.
Oh, wow.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Some comments, perhaps, or questions. I grew up in the tropics, so I'm familiar with these climatic things. And one of the problems with the shading issues and so on, which actually work very well in temperate climates, is that because you have a constant hot climate, so that the buildings can't dissipate the heat. I mean, Britain has a number of examples, early green buildings here, where they have sunshade. It's actually only if you get 10 days of hot weather that they get into trouble. But one of the problems of the buildings you're showing, it seems to me, is that it's only dependent on one thing, which is the shading. The tropical buildings that were very successful in Africa, the early colonial buildings, actually depended on convection currents. They had very high ceilings. They tended to have windows down below and clerestories above, and a convection. And it was actually the air movement that made them bearable. It was not just that you were not at a constant, that basically that evaporated. And I was wondering whether the failure of these things is the fact that they did not dependent on air movement. There's a building which I've actually never seen it in reality, in Harare, for instance, which has these thermal chimneys based on a termite's nest. Also, you can use solar chimneys. I wonder whether the solution. I was thinking of the post, the post-apocalyptic world, the world where we don't have the money to pay for these things. How would we solve these things? And I was also wondering whether there's not mileage in vegetal screens, which you get transpiration as well as the shading and so on. The big problem with this, what you showed us today, seems to be that it was only one strategy, which was the shading. And actually, the earlier buildings used a variety of strategies which complemented each other. I mean, I could think of other examples, but would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's very astute, and thank you very much for the question. I really appreciate it. On the one hand, I think that there's a sort of, there's a narrative flattening in my own, which is to say some of these buildings were more complex than I had the time to talk them through today. Let's leave it at that, but not so much, right? I mean, they were that there was this in Brazil in particular, and very much so in the American South. There was a kind of not an exclusive focus on the facade, but pretty extensive focus on the facade, and I think that it has a lot to do, on the one hand, with the scale of the building. That some of those convection aspects are more complicated, in 20 stories than they are in other contexts. Not speaking generally, right? There's plenty of caveats and exceptions. But also that, they didn't quite function that well. I mean, they were still very hot in the summer. If we were to assess them, back to Jason's earlier question, I guess to answer it a bit more bluntly, is that if we were to assess, let's say, the IRB or or even the Ministry of Education and Health, relative to today's ASHRAE standards, right, they would not stand up well, right? I mean, relative maybe to some of the buildings you're discussing in the tropics with some of these convection systems and often raised and able to kind of induce a certain type of ventilation. Probably not quite as well, but maybe a little closer, right? I mean, I think some of this is quite kind of site specific, but it is an important point. And even the core building that I ran through, the Barcelona project was rooted in a sort of circular ventilation induction system with these kind of lanterns and other sorts of means. But one other thing I want to mention, so it's to say that in part there were a number of architects, and Fry and Drew were quite, part of the curriculum even of the tropical architecture program at the AA. These questions of convection and ventilation inducement were on the table. There's a number of famous diagrams of technical images, right, from their work that are quite explicit about the importance of the passage of air as the kind of determination of comfort, right? And some of that is coming from, Antonin, I'm not remembering his first name, an American practicing for a long time in Japan, who had, I'll remember his name in a minute, but who had developed this sort of diagrammatic system by which, the passage of air next to the body was essential. And of course, since that time, I mean, insofar, many of the studies initially carried out by air conditioning companies, but the sort of theorization of thermal comfort, and here I'll refer you to my colleague Jiathui Cheng at the National University of Singapore, who has written the kind of history of or the kind of another history of air conditioning, that's not just about the Carrier company in the US, but it's about some of its extensions into the tropics. Right, as thermal comfort came to be formalized, it was very much about that kind of experience of airflow, right, and that experience of the kind of, in effect, kind of air washing, as it was somewhat called, the way it sort of cleanses the body, if you will. I'll just briefly mention, though, two close colleagues, and we had a nice recorded, kind of recorded conversation that was published on the online. It's called Platform. That's the name of the platform, is Platform. I can't remember the subtitle. It's actually quite hard to Google, because if you Google platform, but platform, architecture, urbanism, something like that would likely get you there. So we had a discussion actually in about a year ago, as the pandemic was kind of settling in, and we realized we were going to be doing this for a while, thinking about air quality and thinking about windows and opening windows and as a sort of means of reducing viral loads in the air as well. But Dorita Vive, AVIV, who's a colleague of mine at Penn, has in fact been working on, let's call it the sort of technologized version of the thermal chimney, a sort of means to, by using a set of very thin metal components that can help to kind of induce that ventilation, kind of draw the air out. They just won a Wholesome Award that was announced in Venice, I think, a few days ago. And doing amazing work. And then the other discussant in that, one of the other discussants in that platform piece was Adu Abugoyan, who's working on, I mean, just as you suggested, living walls, right, plant systems for interior air quality, and also shading, right. Mei-Ling Loco, another colleague who's at RPI, also working with sort of dynamic vegetal systems to manage to kind of to both, again, both sort of shade and filter air on the exterior, and then also, of course, improve air quality in the interior. And I want to be pretty precise, if I can, to differentiate that sort of work from the kind of Bosco Verticale type of project that I'm sure we all know from Stefano Boeri's project in Milan. A hugely important project in many ways, and I think a kind of icon of so-called kind of sustainable architecture, but I think quite problematic because it's kind of not doing all of the things that plants can do to improve air quality. And I don't know when I get into the details, but I don't want to get into the details, but I do want to differentiate these kind of growing walls and vegetal systems from that sort of potted, planted facade. But thank you so much for that intervention. I'd love to hear more stories, in fact, at some point.
Daniel, I'm very conscious of the fact that we have taken an hour and a half of your time, and indeed an hour and a half of our audience who are still probably delighted to be here. But might have to wrap things up. There was one final question, which I should, I'm sorry to those who I couldn't read out, but Penny asks, or says rather, should we stop talking about modernism as if it was one thing or one moment? You said the project of modernism was to delegitimize customary practice. And Penny says, surely this is a caricature, even in relation to Corbusier's early work.
Yeah, sure. It's an overgeneralization. That's fair enough. But I think that I guess I would say that part of what I'm trying to get at in slightly bombastic statements such as that is that the premise of progress itself, right? I think one thing that I agree. There's multiple modernities, right? One could go on, and I certainly don't mean to imply otherwise, but. And what the whole kind of question of modernism and modernity means so many things in so many different fields. But I think that an aspect of it that's essential to its articulation in architecture is that of progress towards a better future, right? And a sort of opening up to a world that we might even maybe can't quite expect, right? And one could say that about various aspects of modern art as well. And I have fallen in love with that notion myself, right? I mean, this is something that I don't want to speak for others, but I think many of us kind of have experienced is this, excitement about, the kind of new forms and materials and shapes and the effective spaces that we can enter into as transforming the way we think about the world, imagining possibilities that were heretofore unimaginable and kind of seeing into this progressive future. But I think we've also learned, and I mean, just to again be, a little too maybe blunt and specific, that future overlooked not only a whole world of customary practices, a whole set of cultures and communities that were, if not in fact delegitimized, certainly attempted to sort of be moved past, right? Attempted to be exceeded in some way on those terms. But also that again, it was based in the exploitation of natural resources that not only also had profound extractive and exploitative aspects to it, but as we all know, right, is leading us to different conceptions of our futures and of possible in the kind of arcs of history, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do is to kind of dispel that question that modernism is sort of an arrow pointing forward or up, right? And that rather we're in some form of a kind of cyclical condition where some of these practices that seem to have been in the past, the shading devices that seem to have been eclipsed by air conditioning, right? Or that were in fact eclipsed by air, taken over, ASHRAE certainly took command, right? I mean, that we're certainly sort of overwhelmed by air conditioning and the power of fossil fuel energy. That some of those pasts are also futures, right? And this sort of progressive trajectory and this arrow pointing forwards and upwards is at least a bit squiggly, if not in fact kind of, curling around and doing all sorts of strange things that I think we're still trying to get our heads around, right? So if you'll forgive the bombast, I think the ambition here is to, really help try to instigate some thinking about, what is this future that we imagine for ourselves, our families, our communities? What is the architecture that characterizes it? And how does it relate to a diversity of pasts, right? Not only multiple modernities, but, just sort of multiple practices, customary and modern and otherwise, that can help us kind of think in different ways about I don't even want to say ways forward, right? We don't quite have the language for it, right? But next step even sounds too progressive, right? But to kind of think in different ways about what we'll do together as we struggle with the realities of climate instability.
Yeah, would completely agree, and that almost perfectly means
I was trying to end on a good note there.
Thank you. When we were in early discussions about what this talk would be, and indeed when you started speaking, I scrambled to Google to find a quote from Paul Virillo, which I thought was really fitting. So in this quote, Paul is talking about bunkers as a means of survival, but it's interesting, I think, to talk about, at least in the architecture that you presented, as a means of survival in terms of comfort. And one could argue that, we are at war with the planet and indeed ourselves in pursuit of that. So I'll read it out because I'm really interested by it. Paul Virillo says, anachronistic in normal periods. In peacetime, the bunker appears as a survival machine. It speaks to us of other elements, of terrific atmospheric pressure, of an unusual world in which science and technology have developed the possibility of final disintegration. I think that's pretty fitting,
Nice.
particularly as Daniel is a senior fellow at the Kate Humberger Center for Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies at the University of Heidelberg. So perhaps on that note, I'll say thank you to Daniel for that wonderful lecture. And indeed, a note to those online and in person that we have Armin Tahar and Ebony Shire, and indeed Anupam Kundu coming up over the next 3 weeks. So please do stay tuned for those and check our social media and indeed your email inboxes for those and details regarding that. But in the meantime, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Daniel. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Yeah, it's fabulous. Thanks for the questions.
My pleasure. And to those online, goodbye and have a lovely evening.
All right. Take care all. Cheers.